Hey guys, welcome to another week of Boxscore Geeks show. This week, our host with the lovely radio voice, Dre, can't make it, so I'm filling in for him. Arturo and I are going to talk a little bit about the playoffs. We're going to try to keep it short. We're just going to try to go hit style, one series after another, talk about the playoffs, get you guys one and done
I,
here in this podcast.
I'd
Uh,
like to congratulate all the friends of the podcast who are holding slips for the Hawks.
Yeah. So first off, before we get started and talk about individual series, there's a weird thing going on this year where the home teams aren't winning. I can't really remember the last time I saw, teams with like an 8 seed giving away a home team, especially sorry, a 1 seed giving away a home game to the 8 seed, especially a 1 seed that's been as dominant as the Spurs have been, or what's happening in Chicago is just kind of crazy. I think Toronto was a little bit expected because they're a very young, inexperienced team against a team that's sort of deceptive. Because I think everyone would agree the Nets have a bunch of players capable of playing much higher level than they did during the regular season. But I don't know. Let's talk a little bit about this. Why do you think the home teams are struggling this year?
Well, I think partly, I mean, like having the road teams go 9-7 in the first two games of the first round is just insane. I mean, that's like nobody expected that. And I think part of that is, and I mean, there's been some interesting things happening in individual series. You have to take some of these with like a grain of salt. There's some weird stuff happening in that Houston Rockets, Portland Trailblazers, those two games, and like some weird stuff happened in the Clippers first game, where like basically the refs just completely changed the complexion of the game.
Well, yeah, the
And
NBA has in fact came out and admitted that the call against Dwight Howard in Game One was should have gone the other way around. Which, even if you take into account Dwight's very poor free throw shooting, that's basically a 3-point swing right there, right?
Yeah, and those are two games you can take out that you think about it. I think the other one is, I think the Spurs should have lost that game. I think it goes the other way. I think if the Thunder don't play, I mean, the Thunder could have lost that first game. I mean, like they ended up winning by 14, but like the Grizzlies kind of came back from like a 20-point deficit in that game. So I think part of it is it's a very competitive set of teams. I think some of the lower seeds, particularly in the West, are better coached than the teams that they're playing, and I think that actually makes a real difference, particularly in the playoffs. I mean, Terry Stotts is basically treating McHale like a punching bag, and I mean, Scotty Brooks has his limitations, and
Yeah, I think a big key is one in the West things are so tight. The West
yeah,
had the West's the 8th seed in the West would have been one of the best teams in the East. So the West is very tight, especially from spots 1 through 5. And I think another thing is in the East, kind of the reverse is true. The East is not very strong once you get past pretty much the 3 seed or maybe the 4 seed. So you're looking at matchups where normally it would be super clear, like a 3 against a 6, that aren't quite so clear this year.
well, I
Or
mean, I think
4 against 5.
we're on the border of having like a Hawks Wizards like second round playoff series this year, which is just kind of crazy.
Yeah, I mean the big thing. So before we talk too much about that, let's just back it up and let's instead just take the series, one series at a time. Maybe let's start in the East and let's talk about the Bulls against the Wizards. So I mean, we picked the Bulls in this one, and it doesn't look good for the Bulls.
We were talking a little bit about this before the podcast, and I said, look, I got it wrong. I admit I got it wrong. I mean, I thought like Thibodeau was completely going to outmatch Whitman, and Whitman's actually done a pretty fair job. I mean, they're still doing all the dumb things that the Wizards are known to do on offense, but I think, and they keep claiming it's one of its lead assistant, but they're playing smart defense and kind of turning the Bulls into a jump shooting team, and the Bulls can't shoot. So it's really been the story of that series. They can't manufacture points, and they almost have to kind of rethink their lineups and play just something completely off the wall and get more shooting. I mean, I've said maybe they should even think about Jimmer for some stretches of the game. Jimmer, Dunleavy.
You know,
No, they really
I think I
they
see
need
this
they
one a
need
little
shooting.
differently because I see when I watch the games, I see the Wizards taking exactly the shots that Tibbs wants them to take. They take a lot of mid-range jumpers. They force up a lot of contested shots. The problem, though, is that the Wizards are just making shots right now. The Wizards are in a zone. They're hitting lots of shots that I don't think they would normally hit. I don't think anyone predicted Nene, shooting what was it, 11 for 16 or 12 for 17 or what he shot in game one. It's pretty crazy, and I don't know. I mean, it's a bit of a wild card there. I think you're
Yeah,
right though. The Bulls have always had this problem that they can't score. It felt like in the playoffs that's not as big a problem because the playoffs slows down and it's about defense and grinding anyway. but they really are. It reminds me a lot of the series of the Spurs against the Grizzlies last year, where the Spurs just said, "Okay, make Tony Allen shoot, please."
Yeah,
And
that's
it's,
exactly
and it's
that's
kind of like
exactly what they're doing.
everybody on that Bulls roster is kind of like Tony Allen, great defender, can't shoot,
Yeah,
except
and
maybe
I think
Cruiser, right?
I think the other thing is we kind of as said that like the Wizards were going to wilt in the playoffs because they didn't have the experience of the young team and really once you get past Beal and Wall, that Wizards team is deceptively deep. I mean, they've got Ariza, who's the only guy with a ring in this series, been to multiple finals. You've got Gortat, who's been to the finals. You've got Nene, who's been in wars. They put Andre Miller in the rotation. Andre Miller is a guy who's played like more playoff minutes than you know. I mean, he's
They do
been
have a
around
lot of
for a while.
playoff experience on that roster.
Yeah,
So
and it's
let's,
deceptive, and they've actually looked like they've looked like they know what they're doing, and that can't be underrated in the playoffs,
yeah. So let's move on. I'm going to go from sort of what I think is most interesting to least interesting. So next up, I got the Nets and the Raptors. There's another one. I think we all kind of agreed that the Nets have the advantage here, which is kind of weird to say that the 6 team is better than the 3 seed, but the Raptors have almost no playoff experience, and that really does turn out to be a big deal. Plus, the Nets are sort of this. Well, we kind of sucked in the beginning because KG wasn't KG, and we were kind of didn't know what we were doing, but. Oh, by the way, now all our guys are going to play more like they really can play, and all of a sudden the Nets look like a much better team than they did in the beginning of the year. So I feel like the Nets remind me, I forget which year it was, maybe it was like 2002 or so, where the Lakers kind of stumbled into the playoffs as a 6 seed because Shaq was hurt most of the year, and then all of a sudden they destroyed everybody. And I feel like the Nets are kind of doing that sort of unfair thing too, where they get into the playoffs as like a 6 seed, but really, if you look at that roster and that talent, they're probably more like a 3 seed or a 2
There's
seed
a
in the East.
there's a more like easy comparison. The 2010 Celtics, I think, is a better comparison for this team, which is the same thing. They were a better team than what got in. I think. Again, I think this is 4 years on. So I mean, a lot of the guys, the Celtic guys are in here, and I mean, I worry about the age, particularly in the later rounds. I think the thing with young teams is young teams will give away games, and the Raptors kind of gave away that first game, and I think in a series against a team like this, it's going to be hard for them to make it back.
Yeah.
And
Well,
as much as I mean, I like the Raptors. I think they're a great team, but I think giving away games in a series like this is not a good idea.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was. I felt like if you're going to pick an upset, this is the kind of the upset that everyone sort of agrees isn't really that big of an upset.
No,
I mean, it's kind of weird. Like, so moving on then to even less interesting series. Let's talk about the Pacers and the Hawks.
Well, I mean, we said that the Pacers were the worst team in the playoffs, and the Hawks were the second worst team in the playoffs. And so basically, this is not surprising. They're playing like 2 even teams, and the team that's a little hotter and a little healthier right now and a little more together is the one that's winning. And surprisingly, it's the Hawks. I mean, the what's happened to like Roy Hibbert, he's just fallen off a cliff, and it just you watch these games and I mean, yeah, I mean, I think the one time where they managed, they just kind of like benched Hibbert and went small and said, screw it, we're gonna just try to outpower you because we're more talented. That worked in game 2, but they're getting outplayed. And the Hawks, I've said this, the Hawks are more like a 45 to 50 win team that got hurt, and that's when they ended up winning like 30 odd some games. So they've been playing way better.
But you have to admit, like, one of the guys that got hurt is still hurt, right? So it's not like they're magically a 45 win team because Horford isn't back and probably won't be, right?
Well, if they were, I mean, with this roster, if they were healthy for the whole season, they'd be around that 45 win mark. With Horford, they'd be closer to the 50 win mark, 50, like higher on the 50s. I mean, they didn't have like a bad set of like big men. I think again, this is a decent team. I think, I mean, we kind of knew that the Hawks, for stretches they were good, and then like they had that stretch where they had nobody and they were losing and they didn't decide whether they want to go. They were kind of debating whether they're going to tank or not, and they decided, screw it, we're going to make the playoffs, right? And
this team reminds me of Minnesota last year. It was a team we picked this team to surprise everybody. We put some money on the over here, and I think the over was 40 games, right? And despite the fact that Horford and Millsap missed huge chunks of time, they still almost beat that over. So I feel like this is kind of one of those what could have been type of seasons for the Hawks.
We always thought.
Let's talk about the Pacers for a second. So
yeah.
Which team is the real Pacers team? The team that was really hot in the beginning, or the team that was meh at the end? Because we're talking about 2 different samples, right? Do you
I
take
swear.
the whole year and average it out and say, well, it's a 50-win team, or do
No,
you say,
I actually just completely discount the first half of the season and just think, Pacers are like a 40, what we said they were. And, if they played consistently across the season, I said, oh, I'm wrong. But I mean, no. We said they were like a 40, 42, 43 win team, 44 win team. And that's what's been showing up the last half of the season. And I mean, I can't, if the evidence is kind of saying, look, what happened at the beginning of the season was just strange, right? And I think,
so what do you say to a person who looks at you and says, why do you say that the sample at the beginning of the season was the outlier instead of the sample at the end of the season?
Well, I think the other thing is the schedule in the East was strange because all these teams were tanking. And
but weren't they taking more in the second half?
Well, but I can honestly say this, and then they were losing more in the second half. I can honestly say that you put the Pacers in the West, the Pacers don't make the playoffs. I don't think the Pacers make the playoffs if they're playing out West. And that should tell you that they're more of a second tier team that got lucky and got hot, and like their main rivals got hurt, and that once eventually they came down to earth, and everything kind of evened out, and that this is who they are.
Yeah, the mercenary in me really hopes that the Pacers get lucky and get to the conference finals, and that they don't change their team very much next year, because I think there's a big bet on the under next year based on how they might perform. So, is there anything interesting at all to say about the Heat and the Bobcats?
No, I feel bad for the Bobcats for getting that draw. I mean, I thought they would have been better served by getting the Pacers, which it looked like they were going to get the Pacers. And have that happen, and the Heat actually gotten the 1 seed, and the Pacers and the Bobcats gotten the Pacers in the first round. I really would be kind of thinking that the Bobcats had a chance. I think the Bobcats are competitive. They're a good team. They play hard. They're not beating the Heat.
Yeah, I think the relevant thing about the Heat really is to say during the second half of the season, the Heat looked like a totally beatable team. They looked like not quite the champion they were, but now in the playoffs, if Dwayne Wade's going to play every day, forget all that shit you saw in the second half of the season. This is suddenly a dominant team that could totally win the championship again.
Yeah, it was really deceptive because, I mean, as you said, they weren't really trying. They only had to win like 45 games to get the 2 seed.
Yeah,
they didn't really care to get
the 2 seed was never in jeopardy, and they didn't feel like it was worth risking Wade's health to push him hard to try to make the 1 seed. I think that's kind of obvious.
Yeah, the numbers really say that they're the second best team in the league, and they've consistently been the top 3 team the entire season, and that's who they are. They just again this is once you adjust for like people being out, people coming back. So I mean, like the Heat are who they are. I mean, I think the biggest worry for the Heat is the grind, right? So can they survive the 3 rounds and get to the finals without with Wade still being able to walk and Bosh not getting hurt and LeBron not getting hurt and all the older players kind of falling by the wayside.
Okay, let's move out west. Let's first talk about what we thought was going to be the most boring series, but has turned really interesting, which is the Spurs against the Mavericks. I would have thought the Spurs would be cruising at 2-0 with an average margin of victory of 10 points right now, but it's been actually pretty entertaining series. The Spurs had to work pretty hard to win game 1. I don't know. Did you see that coming?
Yeah, well, I mean, you always have a series like that. I mean, I don't know. I really need to go look at the minutes for this series, and I don't know how, if Pop is still kind of playing regular season minutes. The other thing for this series is, the Spurs kind of took them to the woodshed in the last 7 minutes of the first game. They kind of turned it on and completely. It was a little bit Miami-esque. And then, like, in the second game, they had, like, this terrible shooting night, and, like, they just turned the ball over. It's like a weird turnover night for them. It's just one of these nights where, like, nothing works. And so, I mean, my take on this is it kind of is what it is, and I really want to see what happens in Game 3. I expect San Antonio to win Game 3, and I think that's where we're going to find out if we've kind of overrated the Spurs a little bit at this point. Again, at this point, I think it's just, it's 1-1. I really want to see Game 3. And I think Game 2 is something that it's one of those games that just happens. I'm not going to, like when you come in and you turn the ball over, something like 18 times in 3 minutes? Yeah, no, yeah.
Okay, well, what about the Rockets and the Trailblazers? That's been a pretty interesting series, but it's not going our way, is it?
Well, and again, I think the Rockets gave one away. We kind of knew they were going to give one away at some point, which was the first game. I think the league kind of admitted that they screwed up the call at the end. I think, and then you kind of, I mean, I understand what the Rockets are doing, which is saying, look, we're going to let LaMarcus Aldridge shoot as many mid-range jumpers as he wants, but I think, which is plan A, but once he starts hitting every single bad jumper that he's taking, and you kind of have to adjust your defensive strategy to account for that. And I was arguing with Coach Nick Ness last night, and I was saying, look, just why don't you just take a small guy and just chase him around and harass his dribble, and get him like bother him like when he's trying to do the jump shots, and if he comes in, double down on him. And
well,
I think that's
the relevant thing about LaMarcus Aldridge is that those jump shots aren't bad if you're going to cover him like they're covering him right now. I mean,
yeah,
LaMarcus has a very good mid-range jumper, and like most NBA players, most of the reason those mid-range jumpers are bad is because a lot of them are contested and don't have to be shot. But the ones LaMarcus Aldridge is getting and taking, they're great shots, and I would, if I was Stotts, I would be living and dying with that too. I think the way you win against Portland's offense is that you make LaMarcus Aldridge take bad contested shots, not let him take good, easy shots that you're willing to quote-unquote live with. That doesn't make any sense to me. And I think Coach Nick has a point that McHale has sort of been letting Harden play crap defense all year, and it's starting to really hurt them because you get to the playoffs and Harden can't just turn it on and suddenly become a great defender. And I think that's really hurting them a lot. But having said all that, I believe, Game 1 was closer than it should have been. They shouldn't have had the game that close at home, but the league really kind of gave that one to the Trailblazers, which is, again, why they shouldn't have, they couldn't afford to play it that close, and they did.
Yeah, I think as I said, the issue is the plan A, plan B thing. So your plan A is to let LaMarcus Aldridge beat you. But again, what marks a coach is a good coach will say, well, okay, that didn't work because he is actually beating us, so let's adjust. And I think that's where Houston kind of failed. And it doesn't mean that it's not a bad strategy to let him beat you, and kind of force him. That's a shot you want to give up. But you have to be able to recognize the situation and adjust. And I think the other thing is, we were arguing about this that James Harden doesn't look right, and then we've talked about this before. He likes to party, and now you suspect that he may have kind of not been right for that game, and he didn't look right for that game. That's kind of a problem.
Yeah, and it's become a recurring thing that Harden can't seem to get to the line in the playoffs, which is that's his bread and butter in the regular season. And you got to wonder at some point, is a switch going to flip and the refs are going to start giving him the calls that they give a lot of other players, or is it going to stay this way and he's not going to be able to get to the line during the playoffs? And if that's so, the Rockets have kind of a long-term problem in their strategy.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think that's why there's all this noise about Coach McHale not being the right guy for that team.
Yeah, I don't really have a strong opinion about that one way or another, but. So let's talk about the other series in the West, or the other two series in the West. What do you want to talk about next?
Yeah, Let's finish out. I'm gonna probably leave you solo to fly for the last half of the podcast, but
no, you got two series left. You can do it. You can power through. You got two series.
Okay.
What do you want?
I think the Grizzlies and the Thunder is what we thought they were. It's a really competitive series. It's what happens when these two teams meet. I think that, Scotty's not a great coach, and I think the Memphis coach has proven that he is. Memphis can grind it down, and I think nobody argues that the Thunder have the most talent and are very athletically gifted, but they have some serious structural issues which show up in this series. And I think, particularly because neither of these teams can really shoot the ball that well from three, then it plays. This is the best matchup for Memphis could have gotten in the first round, I think, for them.
Yeah, so quick question. Really, why doesn't – what is the Perky Fish obsession that Scott Brooks has?
Well, because he looks across the court and he sees the two big guys and says, I'm going to play Perk, right? And I think that's the right call. It's a traditional – let's play the big guy call, and this is why it's bad. Well, because he's tempted by the fact that Gasol and Sebo are out there, but Perk is a liability and he shouldn't be playing. The same thing with, at this point.
Well, it gets interesting to me because with the regular season being over, we're going to be having a few of our sort of award pieces this year, and one of them is going to be the Rookie of the Year, and I feel like the Thunder have a guy on their roster who could be in that conversation if he'd gotten minutes. Why isn't he getting any minutes in the playoffs?
You mean Steven Adams?
Yes.
Well, I think, again, the problem is if you're Scotty Brooks, if I'm coaching that team, I'm basically, trying out Steven Adams in the regular season and trotting him out there buku minutes. He's good. He needs the reps, and I don't want to get him the reps in the playoffs. I want to get him the reps in the regular season. But Scotty's in love with Perk, and he just, play the hell out of Perk instead of playing Steve Adams 25 to 30 minutes a night. And so now it's kind of hard to throw him out there in a series like this where he's just going to it's kind of a challenge to throw somebody out there on Zebo and Marcus All with like out having the minutes. This is kind of the wrong series to throw them out there on, and it's not like you're getting an easy fish in the first round. You don't even have that, so it's the problem with Brooks. And I think the other thing we notice is that he makes some terrible play calls. Like when he calls a timeout and when he calls a timeout, I'm going to draw up a play, and you hear people start to groan because whatever's going to come out of the timeout is going to be just a terrible play, and they're almost better off when they're just making it up. When Oklahoma's making it up on the fly, they're better off than like when they're being coached by their coach, and this is a real problem. I mean, I think this is probably the most talented team out there, but the results don't match their talent because they're not well coached. I mean, and again, Russ does crazy things, and you kind of, if you've got a guy like Russ who's a little bit out of control, you need to have kind of a rational kind of coach who's training him and teaching him. And Scotty Brooks ain't it, and he hasn't been it. And like while he's still the coach, I don't know if they can win the title.
Ooh, a bold prediction. That reminds me of the old Don Nelson prediction back in the days. Okay, one last series, Clippers and Warriors. This is personally my favorite series. I love this series. I love all the players involved on both sides of the ball here. Every time I'm watching a game, I have no idea who I should be rooting for other than against the referees because it was a travesty. Game one went like, 3.5 hours because the refs just couldn't keep the whistles in their mouths. I mean, these teams kind of don't like each other, and they play hard and they foul each other. But Iguodala, like with 5 or 6 fouls, and Griffin with 5 or 6 fouls, that's just nuts. The
Warriors don't actually
play off basketball.
The Warriors don't actually have a body that they can put on Blake that can actually stop him. They don't. And the only way right now, because Bogut is out, and once he's out, I mean, there's nothing they can do on Blake. And the only way, I mean, like they can say in the series, if the refs take him out, which is what they did in game one. But I mean, you saw game two. Blake is just kind of just bad for this team. They have nothing. It's like if you have to put David Lee on him or Jermaine O'Neal, it's not going to go well. And I actually kind of feel like this might be this is before game three. I actually feel like it might be a blowout. I think the Clippers might take them out to the woodshed. And as much as I kind of wished Bogut was in the series because I think this would have been the most fun series. I think we've seen the best of it. I mean, I think
Bogut's not here. Bogut would have made this series so good.
I think now I kind of feel like the Clips have it in them to maybe win the title, but they really need to find another level, and Chris Paul needs to look right, and he really hasn't looked right. He hasn't looked like himself, right? So he's looked good, but he hasn't looked like the awesome Chris Paul, and they're going to need him at some point. I mean, I think if they're going to get through the Western playoffs, they're going to need him.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the obvious question is how do you think this team? If the Clippers get by the Warriors, and I think they're going to just because of the absence of Bogut, which is sad, but how do you think they match up against the other teams they're going to face here? So if I have the brackets right, they got to go through either Memphis or OKC to get to the Spurs. I feel like they don't match up very well against the Thunder, but they match up really well against the Grizzlies.
I disagree. I mean, I think the Clippers issue is going to be their playoff experience, and it's going to be kind of is Chris Paul right? And I think if Chris Paul is right,
don't you think that they have? I mean, with Jordan and Griffin, they match up actually pretty well with the bruising front court of the Grizzlies.
Yeah, no, they can kill. I think they can kill. They have history with the Grizzlies, and I think that's not this. If I'm the Clippers, I don't necessarily want to see the Grizzlies because they're going to basically attack them with all the big men. The Grizzlies are kind of built to take out because the Clippers don't have big man depth, right? And I think that's their weakness. So the Grizzlies are the wrong.
Neither do the Grizzlies really.
They do. They have.
I guess they have Ed.
What'll happen is they'll throw Kufus and Arthur out there and grind it up and start beating up on Blake and DeAndre and get them in foul trouble and get them out of the games, which is what happened the last 2 years in the series between the Grizzlies and the Clippers.
I guess
it's a bad matchup for them.
Around the fact that Kufos is no longer in Denver, so they do actually have some depth.
Where if it's Clippers Thunder, then the Thunder really don't have big men depth either. So I mean that actually favors the Clippers. If I'm them, I prefer to see the Thunder as opposed to the Clippers.
I mean, if I'm the Clippers, I hate matchups like Matt Barnes or JJ Redick on Kevin Durant. I mean, that's just a nightmare. They don't really have a great wing defender to put on Durant. The closest they have is Matt Barnes. It's just not. It's not.
You have to let you basically your strategy there is basically let Russ be Russ. That's the strategy against the Thunder. Like, let Russ be Russ and let Scotty be Scotty. And again, try to make it so that and make it easy for Oklahoma City not to have the ball in Durant's hand and trap off the ball so he can't get the ball in. And then Russ is tempted to just
Yeah, I
kind
think
of
that's something
start
that
sooling.
Tony Allen is doing a really great job of. I mean,
Yeah, Tony Allen is awesome.
it's making all the news about how Durant shot 5 for 16 against Tony Allen, which is frankly a stat that I think is meaningless when you're only talking about 16 shots. He's basically you add 2 shots and suddenly it's average. But what's really impressive about the way Tony Allen is playing is he's trying to play to keep the ball out of Durant's hands. And when the ball is out of Durant's hands, it's usually in Russell Westbrook's hands, and a lot of bad decisions happen.
Yeah, and I think that's the key to beating the Thunder, and this is where the coach has to step in and kind of draw up plays and put in some logic. The problem is, like, when you have Scotty, you're drawing up bad plays. And it's the hidden secret in the series. Like, what's the score now? I mean, I think the Thunder, the Grizzlies still up.
So unfortunately, I'm nowhere near TV. So
basically the Grizzlies have really been out playing, and I could be completely wrong because they were ahead when I watched it, but the Thunder might have come back. But the Grizzlies have really been out playing after the first half of the first game. So, and it's because of the matchup themselves. I mean, I still think the Thunder will win, but it's, this is a coin flip series, and I think I said this was going to be the closest one of all the series, and I think the most likely to go 7 of all the series that we have. I mean, this one in Toronto Nets, and I think, again, I honestly think it's the Clippers that are going to make it out of this side of the bracket to the Western Conference Finals, and I think it's going to be the Spurs that they're going to be seeing, but it's kind of down to, can these teams who have these flaws kind of overcome? Like, Memphis can't shoot. The Clippers have no big man depth. The Thunder have a really bad coach and a tendency for Russ to do crazy things. I mean, if we look at kind of the teams that are working with their flaws, I mean, like Portland relies too much on the mid-range jumper, but it seems to be working for them right now. The Rockets are their own worst enemy because they do dumb things and they tend not to show up for games or show up in like less than ideal conditions. The Spurs can kind of screw. Apparently, they can kind of screw around. They did a little bit in the season, and it's actually what's showing up in the Mavs series. The Mavs can't cover the rim, right? So the Warriors are missing the best big man. The Warriors actually were close to being. I think the problem with that is they can't cover the rim, and then Mark Jackson doesn't want to adjust to the personnel that he has. He wants to play a certain style. So it's all these teams have these flaws, and it's really interesting to see how it plays out. I thought the Spurs were the least flawed, but
yeah. I think the biggest thing about the Clips against the Warriors is that Spates is such a huge downgrade from Bogut, and it's really killing them in this series.
Well, I mean, I saw the video I put up where, like, if Blake Griffin in the first game of the season I've never seen this before. He did 3 straight alley-oops against the Warriors, right? This is a matchup problem for the Warriors. Blake is a problem for that team. And Blake is really starting to. I mean, if Blake really gets consistent on his mid-range day, he's going to be like LeBron, in terms of well, what do you do with him?
But we've been saying that for years, so let's wait.
What happens if he starts making this is the same thing that happened to LeBron? It's let him shoot the jumper, let him shoot the 3. This is what the Celtics used to do to them, and then eventually LeBron started making them, and Blake's kind of given the indication that he might get to the point where he's doing the same thing, where he's making that mid-range J in the 3, and you're like, well, okay, so what do I do against this guy now? And now he's handling the ball too, LeBron so he's a real kind of if I had to pick somebody to kind of emerge as kind of a marquee talent, Blake might be the guy. I mean, he could, Blake could carry this team to the title, and I think it actually comes down to him. He has to stay on the court, and he has to be like Blake, and if he does that, then they can win the title.
Okay. Got any last thoughts about anything before I go let you cook some potatoes?
I think that, again, we talk about a small sample size, and I think the other thing, people talk about the models, and I think what they have to realize is if I tell you that a team is 70% likely to win a series and another team is 30% likely to win the series, right? And we have 8 series, right? So are we going to see any teams that have a 30% chance of winning? The probability is yes, right? So we're going to have one team that is an underdog. They're going to win a series, right? That's going to happen. And people kind of say, oh, this is not the guy. But it's like, well, the model has a tolerance and a percentage, and you have to kind of account for that. And some unlikely outcomes are going to happen, or less likely outcomes. You're not always going to hit on the most likely outcome because that's not the way it works, right?
Sure.
And I think that's and things we make assumptions, and some of those assumptions are wrong. So I assume that
Yeah.
McHale and Stottsville didn't even
To
match
be
up. I
honest,
assumed that. Go ahead.
yeah, I'll be flat out honest with the viewers here. The only reason I do prediction or I even have predictions on the site at all is because it drives the page views and it's what people want to see. And people want to, and frankly, most of the time people just want to see us be wrong. People want to see us fail miserably.
Oh, yeah.
And that drives page views, and so I'm all for it. I don't actually think that the prediction models have a ton of value. I mean, I put some money on it when I go to Vegas at the beginning of the season because I have some confidence in certain outcomes. But for the most part, I mean, if you look at it, I only bet on I think it was 8 or 9 teams, even though we made predictions for 30. So clearly, my confidence level is not high enough to put lots of money on lots of them, and there's tons of variance involved. And so I mean, what's produced is a I think the explanatory model is much more useful than a prediction model.
Yeah, I think
but
one statement I'm going to make about that, which is, we were focused on getting all the previews up, and we were focused on getting the site up, and we were focused on getting certain things up. And there were things I did the previous year, right, in terms of what I think makes a better prediction model that I really didn't have time to do this year, but I will have time to do next year. I mean, like there is a lot of the guys we read and guys we follow do a lot of blended models, and they do lots of kind of little tweaks and little adjustments, which if you look back at what I did the previous year, I did something like I did a blended model with a couple of different stats, and that actually did a much better than this year. And I mean, we kind of understand that. And I think, as you're saying, we were just wanting to get the previews up. We want to talk about what was happening. Sure. And again, the prediction itself was more secondary. I think
I'm frankly not that interested in most of the predictions because if you look at a team, for example, like the Spurs, you go to the beginning of this season, it's not like there was a guy in this corner saying the Spurs are going to win 38 games and a guy in this corner saying the Spurs are going to win 55 games. We kind of just all agreed the Spurs are going to be a great team, and we're all plus minus 3 wins in the high 50s, 60s. That's not very interesting, and the reason it's not very interesting is because the Spurs didn't change very much personnel. So there's every year there are 5 or 6 teams that are really interesting, and those are the teams that change a lot of personnel, like the Lakers, the Jazz, the Knicks, to some extent the Raptors. Even one of the changes didn't happen until later in the season. But I mean, those are the teams that you like to predict because that's where you actually see there's going to be variance here. Some people are going to
get the errors and the outliers are where wisdom is to be found. And I think I wrote a whole Sloan paper.
I don't think we did as good a job in the outliers as we have done in previous years, but I am pretty confident that we're going to do pretty well in the next, 10-year, 20-year timeline.
Things shift back. I mean, there were some things that were going on that were interesting. I said the outliers drive like new knowledge. So we know that people are changing the offensive systems and the defenses they run. That's making a big difference. And I think the big example there, Indiana was a big example a couple years ago. Portland was a huge example this year because they did something very different in how they run their offense, what kind of threes they take, what kind of shots they give up. And that actually made a really big difference. It's a different style of game. So it's kind of like if anybody who's a soccer fan, if somebody's switching from like playing like an Italian style of game to playing more of an English style of game, even with the same players, it's going to make a huge difference in your performance. And I think generally that's not something that happens in the.
It sounds like someone's cooking in your kitchen back there. So I'm going to try to wrap things up. So,
I think I'm gonna close with a thought that basically, as you said, we'll keep working on this and we'll keep making this better. But I think again, to your point, we do it because it's interesting. And we understand that and I said we were a post saying we're going to be wrong, right? And we explain why we're going to be wrong. We explain that they're there, and it'll keep happening.
If there's one thing I stand for, it's the scientific method, and we put our methodology out there so others can reproduce it if they want. Not many volunteers so far, and sometimes we're wrong. But I don't think that the results of any one series or season is really a big indication one way or the other. So I'm just going to wrap this up and say thank you all for watching and enjoy the games tonight. I think there's a game starting in a few minutes, which I'm going to go try and watch. I wish everybody a happy first round of the playoffs.
Yeah.